Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're coming to you from today. I'm on the lands of the Ngadjuri people in the mid-north of South Australia, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be in attendance today. ACS also supports diversity and inclusion of all types. Diversity and inclusion are important to the ACS as we represent a diverse membership from many backgrounds. Good evening and welcome to tonight's Industry Insights. My name is Jo Stewart-Rattray. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Silverchain Group and Vice President Communities for the Australian Computer Society. I'm also the Oceania Regional Ambassador for ISACA, having served on its International Board of Directors for some 7 years. There will be Q&A for all of you this evening. If you really want to jump in and ask questions, please do. When we approach the audience Q&A component, please use the Q&A box on the sidebar on the right-hand side of your screen and take the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have. We'll try our best to go through as many questions as possible while we're online. Tonight, I'm really delighted to welcome my colleague from ISACA Global, Sophia Kazi. She's a privacy professional practices principal at ISACA, and I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Sophia. ACS is excited to be growing our partnership with ISACA as both organisations are dedicated to combining knowledge and resources. We're on a mission to enhance technology governance, bolster cybersecurity standards, and provide top-notch professional development opportunities for our constituency bases. Our goal is to cultivate a thriving digital ecosystem right here in Australia. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And Sophia, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jo, and thank you to ACS for having me here today. I am really excited today to go over the findings of ISACA's 4th annual State of Privacy Survey. Now, throughout the survey, I will be focusing largely on the findings of our global representatives, but I'll also take a deeper dive into what we found from our respondents in Oceania. And if there's anything from this region that I haven't covered, but you are curious about, please let us know in the Q&A. I have all of this data in front of me, so I can pretty easily look things up. Now, some of the key takeaways for today's presentation, we'll look at privacy teams in Oceania, but also around the globe. We'll take a look at staffing trends, skill gaps, how long it takes to hire, and understaffing. We'll look at some trends that we see among organizations that always practice privacy by design. We, of course, have to talk about the elephant in the room, artificial intelligence, and how it is or isn't being used for privacy-related work. And we'll also take a look at privacy breaches and what we might see as far as privacy breaches go in the next year. But before we get into the findings of our survey, let's talk about some of the big privacy headlines in 2023. So laws and regulations were changing rapidly in 2023. We saw some new enforcement actions go into place, specifically with the EU-US data privacy framework. This was an adequacy decision that affected the way that data is transferred from Europe to the United States. I know that there was a big development in Australia with the privacy framework being set to be revamped and the changes that this may bring over the next coming years. In the United States, we do not unfortunately have a nationwide privacy law. However, several states in the last year passed privacy laws, which makes it incredibly complex to be compliant with numerous laws and regulations that may at times be at odds with each other. Now, I have a picture of a car on this slide. I don't know if any of you read the report by Mozilla Foundation. So they do a lot of really great work about the privacy of various consumer goods. And so last year, they released their first report about vehicle privacy. They examined the top car manufacturers in the United States, and unfortunately, not a single manufacturer received a passing privacy grade. A lot of them collect far too much information for purposes that are very unclear. For example, the car that I have, that I purchased in 2013, claims that it is allowed to collect information about the user's intelligence and sell that. It's highly concerning. And the reason that I mention it is because people who are ordinary consumers, not working in privacy or technology, are starting to think about the implications of what happens when they sit in their car and all of that information is being sold. And of course, AI was a huge topic. Now, it was really the end of 2022 that we started to see a lot of adoption of generative AI tools, things like ChatGPT. But I would say that it was 2023 that we really started to grapple with the privacy implications. The decision was changed, but Italy actually banned ChatGPT due to privacy concerns. And although people in Italy can use ChatGPT again, the privacy concerns remain and are in fact something that we're going to be thinking about moving forward. Now, I mention all of this just to keep in mind as we go through the survey findings. And as you can see, privacy professionals have a lot that they are trying to do. So on to our survey findings. I'll start with just some demographic information and some methodology. So we initially sent this survey to 15,000 constituents who work in privacy. Of those people, just over 1,300 actually completed the survey in full. You can see here that the top industries that our survey representatives came from were technology services and consulting, finance and banking, and government. We had a really good spread as far as years of experience go. We had some respondents who were very seasoned, and we had quite a few respondents who were a little bit newer in their careers. You can also see total revenue here. And one thing I will point out is there were a few demographic differences here when we look at Oceania versus our global respondents. Of our respondents in Oceania, 35% of them were from organizations that had under US $50 million in revenue, and 20% were from these organizations that had more than $1 billion in revenue. And so also just taking a further look at the demographics piece of that, you can see that 4% of our respondents were from Oceania. That may seem small, but you'll see as we go throughout the presentation, for the most part, the findings were consistent with overall global responses. We also saw that in Oceania, there were some differences as far as the number of employees at an organization. Specifically, 13% of our respondents in Oceania were from these very large organizations that had 25,000 or more employees. So do just keep this information in mind as we go through some of the more region-specific statistics. So let's get into staffing trends and some interesting things that we noticed as far as staffing goes. So we asked our survey respondents how long it takes to fill open privacy positions. And I should note that for the purposes of this survey and our results, we think about privacy professionals of falling into one of two groups. There's legal and compliance professionals. These are often lawyers. They are people who can look at the full text of a regulation and have a rough idea of what it's asking. There are also technical privacy professionals, and I imagine most of you listening to this now fall into that group. These are people who have a strong knowledge of the controls that can be used to achieve privacy objectives, but they may not have the legal expertise needed to, for example, read GDPR and understand exactly what it's asking. Of course, there are a few people that fall into both of these groups, but for the most part, we tended to think of them in two different ways. And unfortunately, it takes a long time to hire the right privacy professional. A quarter of our respondents say that it takes 3 to 6 months to fill open privacy positions, and 16% say that it takes more than 6 months. Now, 18% of our respondents said that the time to fill legal and compliance roles somewhat or significantly increased. This is actually identical to last year's findings. 19% of respondents said that the time to fill open technical privacy positions had increased, which is actually a slight decline from last year when 23% of our respondents said that. Now, as far as privacy staff sizes, the median privacy staff size this year was 9 employees compared to 10 last year, so not a significant difference here. And as far as how exactly people go about determining if someone is qualified, the thing that hiring managers are most looking for is experience. So on this slide, we have our respondents and how much they're saying that these factors are very important. Ultimately, compliance and legal experience, hands-on experience in a previous privacy role, and technical experience are quite important. Credentials held is also very important, and I think this makes a lot of sense. 44% of our respondents said that more than half of their organization's privacy staff started their careers in a totally different field and then transitioned to privacy. In fact, only 18% of our respondents said that more than half of their enterprise's privacy staff started their careers in privacy. I think this is a really great sign for anybody who's curious about getting into privacy. There isn't necessarily a certain degree that you need to have. It's quite possible you have the expertise, and just doing something like earning a credential can help you pivot to a career in privacy. There were some interesting differences as far as Oceania goes compared to our total global respondents. Of those in Oceania, 85% said technical experience was important compared to 93% of our global respondents. And interestingly, the recommendation from a previous employer was viewed to be much more important in the region, with 87% saying that it was very important in determining if a candidate was qualified. And so we also wanted to know about skill gaps and skill deficiencies. So this slide is comparing what we saw from our global respondents to those in Oceania. You'll see that there are a few similarities, but there are a few areas of differences that I would like to draw your attention to. Our respondents in Oceania identified experience with frameworks and controls as being more of a skill gap, as well as understanding the laws and regulations to which an organization is subject, business insights, soft skills, and business ethics. I actually would like to focus on the business ethics piece because every year I've been surprised that it's not identified as more of a skill gap. And it's a little bit concerning because I do worry that organizations just don't care about ethics. And the challenge is privacy and ethics are so intertwined. Of course, there can be a lot of money if you collect excessive amounts of data or sell data without people knowing it. However, that's not acting in an ethical way. So I actually think it's a great thing that our representatives who are in Oceania are a little bit more concerned about business ethics. Joe, can you weigh in a little bit? Is any of this surprising to you? And I'm curious, why do you think that technical expertise might not be as big of a skill gap for our respondents in that region?
I think it's an interesting point. And I'd just like to mention that for those who are wondering, Oceania, in our terms, is talking about Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea, which make up the Oceania region for ISACA. So that's what, when we're talking about Oceania, that's the spread we're talking about. Look, I think I'm not surprised at the business ethics element. I think that's something that we're quite focused on. There's a little bit of conservatism in this region on that sort of stuff. So that's not surprising. The understanding of laws and regulations, yes, I do think that's a skill gap because there is a lot to know. And as you pointed out, our privacy regs and legislation is on the move. So it's going to be interesting to see where that lands. Technical expertise, that is an interesting point. You know, why is it not perceived as a bigger skills gap than it is outside of the region? Not entirely sure, but I think there might be that perspective that it can be learned. That I think that's it. You know, if somebody is in an organisation, particularly one of those larger organisations, there might be the opportunity for career development for them to move across into privacy, whether it come from legal, or they might come from corporate, or they might come from governance, or they might come from security even. And so I think that might be about that cross-pollination within organisations rather than it being anything else.
That actually makes a lot of sense. And that totally tracks with what we're seeing as far as how organizations are going about addressing some of these skill gaps. Half of our respondents say that they're training people who are not in privacy but are interested to move into privacy roles. Joe, that totally touches on your point that, you know, people can come in from different areas. They might be from security, governance, legal, and it might be as simple as you have someone in your organization who knows your technology. They know your customers. They know your business. And so to earn a certification in privacy is significantly easier than posting a job ad, waiting potentially more than 6 months to find the right candidate for the role. Now, 39% of our respondents said that they're leveraging contract employees and outside consultants. And then a quarter of our respondents said that they're leveraging performance-based training to attest to skill mastery. And I think that also touches on that idea of maybe you have someone who can just be trained in privacy to fill that role. Some other strategies that were used was an increased reliance on AI or automation, and we'll talk a lot more about that in detail in just a bit, as well as leveraging apprenticeships and internships. So overall, the main key finding as far as demand goes is it is only expected to increase. And this is true for legal and compliance professionals as well as technical privacy professionals. Now, I will say this year's respondents didn't think that the demand for privacy professionals would increase as significantly as last year's. Last year, 62% of people said they thought the demand for legal and compliance roles would increase, and 69% said they thought the demand for technical privacy professionals would increase. Oceania was pretty much on track with this. 50% anticipated an increase in demand for legal and compliance professionals, and 56% saw an increase for the demand of technical professionals. So Joe, overall, it looks like the demand is increasing. Good news for people who are working in privacy. I'm curious, why do you imagine that that finding is consistent in Oceania as well as the whole world? Why are we seeing this upward trajectory?
Oh, I think there's a much more recognition of the need for controls around privacy. You know, if we look at in Australia in the last couple of years, we've had a number of significant breaches, and I think that's made people have a laser focus on what it means, both in the privacy and the security spaces. And there's a lot more discussion about where privacy meets security. You know, the Venn diagram approach, and that little bit in the middle is where we should be working together. So I think that doesn't actually surprise me. I think, unfortunately, it's because of the data breaches, the significant data breaches that we've faced in this part of the world, that we've suddenly got this greater focus.
Absolutely. So now let's move on to privacy operations and see what privacy looks like in practice when organizations are doing it. So we asked our survey respondents, how often are you collaborating with these various teams? And so this is showing the percentage of respondents who say they always or frequently collaborate with these areas. I think the top three aren't particularly surprising. Of course, privacy professionals are working with security professionals, legal and compliance, and risk management. I would, however, like to draw your attention to the bottom of this chart. I'm a little surprised and concerned that only 34% of our respondents say that they're regularly working with procurement and product and business development. And the reason that I would hope that this is higher is that if you are practicing privacy by design effectively, you need to work closely with these groups. If you have a procurement team that's going out and acquiring software or resources that are not in line with your privacy objectives, the privacy team is set up to lose. Additionally, if there are new business developments happening that don't respect the customer, that don't respect their data, there's only so much privacy professionals can do to try and build privacy in at the end. I hope as organizations become a little bit more mature, they will be able to spend a little bit more time with procurement and product and business development to ensure that everything the organization is doing is thinking about the data subject and their rights. And so we also took a look at accountability and who was ultimately accountable for privacy in an organization. And there were some really interesting regional differences here. So of our global respondents, 21% said that a chief privacy officer was ultimately accountable for privacy. However, it was only 9% for Oceania. However, for our respondents in Oceania, the CEO was far more likely to be the person who's ultimately accountable for privacy. I should note, there isn't necessarily a correct person to be accountable for privacy, but I do want you to note if you are in an organization where privacy does not report to the chief privacy officer, be aware of potential conflicts of interest. So let's pick on security. There might be times when security is at odds with privacy. Privacy might say, for this particular initiative, we want anonymity. Think of something like an ethics hotline where people can anonymously report something that they saw at the organization. Security professionals might say they want non-repudiation and they want to know exactly who sent the message. these could be at odds. Additionally, legal could potentially also be an area where there are conflicts of interest if privacy reports to them, specifically because privacy professionals are focused on protecting the data subject. In contrast, legal counsel, chief general legal officers are a little bit more focused on protecting the enterprise. So the one thing I will note is if you are at an organization where you don't report up to a chief privacy officer, just remember that ultimately your goal is to protect the people who have trusted you with their data. And I hope that this can help provide you with the ability to have some difficult conversations. Joe, can you give us some idea on why accountability might vary so significantly in Oceania? And is chief privacy officer just a less common role in the region?
It is a less common role, Safia, that's for sure. In this part of the world, we're not very good at giving out titles. We're not very good at giving out chief titles in particular. So oftentimes you'll find an organisation will have a privacy officer, but not a chief privacy officer. So it's where that privacy officer reports to is the important part. You know, we sometimes see it reporting directly to the Audit and Risk Committee, which is not a bad place, right? Because that takes out that conflict issue that you've just been talking about. Excuse me. But we do often see it reporting to Chief General Counsel. And as you say, that's potentially an issue because oftentimes procurement, head of procurement also reports to Chief Legal Counsel. So that becomes definitely a potential for that level of conflict. It's interesting in my working life, I never thought I would be working so closely with legal counsel as I do today. And that's because of procurement and because of privacy. So almost so many things that I'm doing, any changes that I want to put through, I need to actually check that through with legal counsel. And they see my name flick out, and I'm sure flick up on Teams, and they've probably go, oh no, it's her again. But I'd rather be sure and ask the questions than get it wrong, because I might have it right from the security perspective, but I also want to make sure I'm getting it right from the privacy perspective. So I think this is really interesting. I think the other issue that we have is about boards of directors. How is it reported to them about the privacy issues? I mean, security has had that issue for a long time. So for me, I think we're seeing the same issues with privacy that we saw with security maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. We looked at accountability and tried to see if there were any other trends that we could find. And one thing that was really interesting is enterprise size had a lot to do with who's ultimately accountable for privacy. So 27% of our respondents who were from organizations with under 250 people said the CEO was accountable, while 32% of respondents from organizations with more than 25,000 employees said that they had a chief privacy officer accountable. I think this makes a lot of sense. If you have a 1 or 2 person privacy team, it doesn't make sense to have a C-level executive focused exclusively on privacy. And I think some of the tips that Joe mentioned are really good to keep in mind. Keep those conflicts of interest in mind and understand how exactly privacy should communicate with other stakeholders in the organization. And so on the note of board of directors, we asked our survey respondents, is your board adequately prioritizing privacy? And the good news is the majority say that it is. And this is comparable in Oceania. 55% of respondents say that their board is adequately prioritizing privacy, which is great news. One thing that is interesting is we asked our survey respondents how their board views privacy programs. Do they view it from a compliance approach? We do privacy because laws and regulations tell us to. Do they do it from an ethical approach, which is we protect privacy because it's the right thing to do? Or is it a competitive advantage? Either our competitors do privacy really well and we need to compete with them, or is it our competitors are terrible with privacy and we want to stand apart? 44% of our respondents said that they're using a compliance-driven approach, and this is a bit higher than last year when it was only 33%. The reason this is a little bit concerning is a compliance-driven approach is predominantly reactive. You're waiting for a law or regulation to tell you what to do, and then you're doing it. In some of these organizations, there may not be a clear objective for how privacy should operate or what the privacy team wants to do. So if you are an organization that is purely compliance driven, I'd encourage you to think a little bit beyond that, especially because it could actually make compliance easier if your baseline is to do privacy really well. Joe, can you tell us a little bit about boards of directors in Australia? Are they talking about privacy, and what do those conversations look like?
I think it depends on the board, and I think it depends on the kind of organisation that they are the board members for. Excuse me. I think that's the big issue. If it's an organisation that is people-centred, then you're going to see that they're going to be really concerned about privacy. I think there is a bit of a disconnect between the breaches that we've seen, the data breaches that we've seen, and the understanding that it's not just a security or technology issue. This is also a privacy issue. And I think there needs to be some more education of board members in that respect. But I do think there's certainly a growing understanding, just as we're seeing a growing understanding around the cyberspace as well. And, you know, as a board member myself, I have to say it's really quite something with all of the things that you now need to be across to be a board member. It's not just being able to read a set of financials, but there are all of these other elements that you have to consider. And the most important thing is about, as you're saying, about the data subject. Whose data do we hold? Why do we hold it? What was the consent given for? And are we indeed using it for the purpose for which it was gathered? I think they're the sort of things that they're really basic questions, but they're things that board directors should be asking.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk a little bit about privacy funding. Now, if ACS told me I could only share one slide and only talk for 2 minutes, this is the slide I would share because this is the most shocking finding that we've had. We asked our survey respondents what is going to happen to their privacy budget over the next 12 months. This year, 51% of respondents said they believe their privacy budget is going to decrease. As you can see on this slide, it has never even been this close. Even in 2021, which was coming on the heels of all of the disruption from the pandemic, it wasn't even half of that. This is especially concerning because 63% of respondents who believe that their privacy budget is already underfunded anticipated that their funding would be slashed further in the next 12 months. Unfortunately, Oceania is on par with the rest of our global respondents, with 56% of respondents in the region saying that they anticipated their privacy budget would decrease in the next year. I'm kind of not entirely sure why this is happening. You know, of course, we know that there's a little bit of global downturn happening. We're reading headlines about layoffs. I'm sure some people have been affected by budget cuts. However, it looks like privacy might be disproportionately affected. So ISACA also does a state of cybersecurity survey, and in our 2023 survey, only 11% of respondents said that they anticipated a decrease in their cybersecurity budget. Now, my theory is that some organizations are going to task cybersecurity professionals with privacy work. In addition to all of their security work and all of the challenges they're facing, they may also have to take on privacy work. This is definitely the finding that we're keeping the closest eye on to see what happens this time next year if, in fact, these budget cuts did happen. Joe, what do you think are going to be some of the impacts if privacy budgets do, in fact, decrease for, let's say, over half of organizations in Australia?
I think it's really scary. It's a visceral reaction for me to see those sort of numbers. It's almost as though, again, I take it back to what security was probably facing 10 years ago. It's seen as a discretionary spend. It's something that, it's a nice to have, not a must have. But if our legislation, as is mooted, does change significantly, then you can't afford to be behind the 8 ball on this.
Yeah, it's just so interesting that people say that their board adequately prioritizes privacy, but we're still seeing potentially massive budget cuts. I mean, it's the work of a privacy professional is not going to be easy. And it's like you said, the rapidly changing regulatory landscape is not helping at all. And so on that note, let's talk a little bit about compliance. We asked our survey respondents which frameworks or regulations are they using to manage privacy. I think unsurprisingly, GDPR was the most common. We did, however, see a lot of regional differences here. As far as the Oceania region goes, 57% of our respondents in that area say they use the Australian privacy principles, 26% use ISO IEC 27002, and then 24% say they use GDPR, and then another 24% say they use COBIT. Also, if we look at Europe, our respondents in Europe, 78% say they use the GDPR, and of our respondents in the United States, 61% use the NIST privacy framework. So it's not entirely surprising that that's happening. Joe, can you tell us a little bit about Australian organizations and their challenges as far as compliance goes? I know that potentially there's going to be changes as far as the regulatory landscape in Australia, but there's also the broader global landscape. What does that look like?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. The global landscape is, I agree, it's ever changing as well, and particularly as we see that we're in a state of conflict across the world currently. I mean, that also makes a difference to our privacy position or posture, I think. There is discussion here about the potential for GDPR type legislation. If we go down that path, I mean, that's a broad brush. We know how long it took to get into the EU. So I have to say, I'm not sure we need to go quite to that extent, given the size of the organisations that we're talking about in Australia. Australia runs, as does New Zealand and certainly Papua New Guinea, we operate on small to medium enterprise. That's who we are. We're entrepreneurial and we're innovators, and we often, if we can't find the right job, we create our own by creating our own business. So I think that's the difference, and I think we have to be very mindful of that when we're talking about compliance with laws. It doesn't mean that you're exempt from it, but it just means that you have to craft it so it's possible for small to medium enterprise to be able to comply, because compliance is incredibly important. Because I go back to those data points, there's actually a person at the end of those data points, and that's who we have to consider.
Absolutely. It's a great reminder. I think it's easy when we talk about privacy to just start talking about laws and regulations and forget that we're ultimately talking about protecting people. And so on the note of compliance, we talked about collaboration a little bit before, but we wanted to zoom in on the collaboration between technical privacy professionals and legal and compliance professionals, because ultimately these two have a lot of work that can overlap. So we asked our survey respondents about how often they're meeting with legal and compliance professionals, and the good news is most respondents are doing this with some frequency. This is really critical because legal professionals have their finger on the pulse and know what exactly is on the horizon. We may hear about things like GDPR, but many people who are working in technology aren't aware of the latest enforcement decisions. They may not have been the most up to date on things like Schrems 2 and what that means for organizations and how they function. And additionally, technical privacy professionals can walk legal professionals through the technology and what that looks like. And together, they can work to ensure that what they have implemented is actually functioning as they desired. A big part of the laws and regulations is that in many areas, data subjects have more rights. So we asked our survey respondents about the data subject requests that they were receiving. Think about things like deletion, portability, and 31% of our respondents said the number of data subject requests that they'd received had increased in the last year. Interestingly, 33% of our respondents said they don't know, but I suspect that a lot of our respondents tend to skew a little bit more technical, and so they're probably not the people who are dealing with these daily data subject requests. We talked about compliance and how challenging it is, but that said, a lot of our survey respondents say that they feel pretty confident in ensuring data privacy and achieving compliance. That said, it is still a very complex issue, so it's not entirely surprising that 13% of our respondents are either not so confident or not at all confident in their ability to be compliant. All right, so let's talk about the thing that everyone's probably been wondering about, AI, and how it is or isn't being used for privacy. So we asked our survey respondents if they are using AI for privacy, and 8% of our respondents said they were. Now in Oceania, that was a little bit higher at 13%, but it is still lower than what I would have expected. Last year, of our global respondents, 11% said they were using AI. So it's actually gone down a little bit. And also in last year's survey, 20% of respondents said they plan to implement AI for privacy tasks in the next 12 months. But as you can see here, that obviously did not happen. One of the reasons that I find this so surprising is that 41% of respondents to a recent ISACA survey about generative AI said that their organization's employees were using generative AI. Now, it's just possible that privacy professionals aren't part of that. But one thing, if we can just take it a step further, is I want to challenge privacy professionals to examine if people in their organization are using AI, and if so, is there a policy around it? Are they involved in discussions about privacy and AI and leveraging that? So one thing that really stood out to me is the reluctance and hesitance to use privacy-related AI resources. 36% of our global respondents said they have no plans to use AI for privacy work, and 38% of our respondents in the Oceania region said they have no plans to use AI for that function. This is actually kind of a good sign, especially when we cut this across organizations that have some fewer resources. So 49% of respondents in organizations with under 250 employees said they had no plans to use AI for privacy-related tasks. Additionally, 45% of respondents who said they're not at all confident in their organization's data privacy abilities said they had no plans to use AI. The reason I find this a really good thing is it shows me that the people who are responding to our survey understand that AI is not a panacea for all of their problems. It's not going to fix underfunding. It can't fix understaffing. And as a matter of fact, to do AI well, it's going to require resources. It's going to require policies, governance, oversight. And for an organization that's already struggling, those are just not resources worth putting into that. Joe, are you surprised at all by the slightly higher adoption of AI in Oceania? And can you also tell me, are regulators in Australia talking about AI?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. The Australian government was actually a little bit slow to make statement about AI. We've certainly seen discussion now. I think there needs to be some definitive legislation put in place around the ethical use of AI, and certainly the ethical use of AI in the privacy context is very important as well. So, and I think it's an interesting notion that 38% of organisations in this region will not use it, have no plans to use it. I think there's a fear around the use of AI, and rightly so in many respects when it comes to the bias within algorithms. And we certainly don't want to see that coming up again when the data points are people at the end of the day in the privacy sphere. So I think there's a lot to be discussed there, and I think there's a lot to be socialised in this space as well. And I do think there needs to be some really good guardrails put in place so that organisations know what is appropriate and what is not, because this is where ethics comes into it again. To me, the ethics of AI is really important too, to make sure that we're not discriminating against any of those data subjects at all.
Absolutely. That guardrail point is so important because I think for some organizations, they're just hoping if they don't release a policy around the use of AI, they don't have to address it. But unfortunately, that's not the case. It's better to have something in place, even if it's a policy that needs to evolve. We're talking about this. It's a rapidly evolving area. It might be used in ways that we can't even imagine in the future. So if you don't have an AI policy in place, it's probably worth drafting something.
I think it's interesting too, Sophia, that the UK, for instance, actually has called generative AI a potential risk for national security. And have flagged it as such. So that's the other thing, that's the nation state stuff. So, we have to take heed of that. That's a little bit scary too.
Absolutely. I'm really curious to see what happens when we do the survey next year. Is the adoption of AI going to potentially even go down further for privacy related work? It remains to be seen. So now let's talk a little bit about privacy by design. So if you're unfamiliar with it, privacy by design is just the idea of integrating privacy into the entire engineering process. We asked our survey respondents how often their organization is practicing privacy by design. And the good news is over half of our respondents say they're always or frequently practicing it. One thing that's really interesting is 44% of our respondents said that not practicing privacy by design is a privacy failure. So why aren't 44% of our respondents always practicing privacy by design? Well, ultimately, it comes down to resources. Organizations that always practice privacy by design just tend to have more resources. We compared those who always do privacy by design to our total respondents, and we found that they had a median privacy staff size of 15 compared to just 9. They were also more likely to say that their technical privacy department was adequately staffed, their board appropriately prioritized privacy, and that their budgets were appropriately funded. They were also less likely to say that their board views privacy as purely compliance-driven, which makes a lot of sense. As I mentioned, that compliance-driven approach does tend to be a lot more reactive, and one of the key tenets of privacy by design is to be proactive, not reactive, so that's not entirely surprising. I will note that respondents who work in enterprises that always practice privacy by design were more likely to be completely and very confident in the ability of their organization's privacy teams to ensure data privacy and achieve compliance. It was 71% for them compared to 43% of our total respondents. However, this may be false confidence. Enterprises that always practice privacy by design were just as likely to have experienced a material privacy breach in the last year as compared to our total respondents. I don't say that to discourage you from practicing privacy by design. It's quite possible that those organizations that practice privacy by design and had a breach had less harm to their data subjects. Perhaps they didn't have a lot of the reputational damage or fines. But it is to say that just because you're practicing privacy by design, don't allow that to give you a false sense of confidence and make you think that you are immune to privacy breaches. So let's talk a little bit about privacy awareness training and what that looks like in organizations. Now, 86% of our survey respondents say that they provide privacy awareness training. Now, in Oceania, 69% say they provide privacy awareness training, so it is a little bit lower than our global respondents. Overall, 66% of our respondents say they provide privacy awareness training annually, 52% do it as part of new hire training, and then 18% do it quarterly. As far as Oceania goes, 45% provide it annually. Joe, can you tell us why privacy awareness training might not be provided as often or as commonly in this region compared to our global area?
I still think it's something that organizations are coming to grips with. I'm still not sure they understand the need for privacy awareness training. Again, I have to liken it to my own professional background, being a security professional. You know, we've had that same issue for so long that it's taken a long time for security awareness training to be part of the landscape, and in fact to be required under many contracts these days. If you're looking to contract to government, and security will be taken into consideration, and therefore security awareness training. I think we need to get to that point with privacy where, you know, we need to get to that critical mass before we're going to see that happen. I know in my own organisation, one of the things that I've done is work with a privacy officer and develop some privacy and security training. So it's where it differs, and we've pointed out where it's different, where it's very similar, and that bit in the middle where we're working together. So I think that's the other thing. It's about how do you approach it. And depending on the size of the company, you know, a small company, they're going to have to be going outside for this training as well. It's highly unlikely that they're going to be having a permanent professional on staff that can assist them with it. So I think that's part of the issue with the numbers in this region.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. You know, part of a privacy awareness training is not just providing the same exact training year over year. So we asked our respondents how often their organization is reviewing and revising privacy awareness training. And the good news is most organizations are looking at it and evaluating it annually. This is true in Oceania as well. 51% of our respondents in that region say that they're reviewing and revising privacy awareness training annually. So nearly half of our respondents said that a lack of training or poor training was a common privacy failure. And that's one of the reasons that it is so important to look at your privacy awareness training program and ensuring that it is in fact working the way that you had expected. So we asked our survey respondents, what exactly are the metrics that you're using to evaluate how effective your privacy awareness training program is? And unfortunately, I am not a big fan of the top 3 metrics, and I'll tell you why in just a bit. The most common thing that organizations do is they look at the number of employees who've completed privacy awareness training. This is true in Oceania as well. Our 64% of our respondents in the region say that that's the metric they look at. This isn't a great metric because it doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the training. You don't know if people learned anything. It's almost just treating it like a check the box exercise. Did people watch that 1-hour video? Okay, that's great. It's not actually telling you if people are empowered to act in ways that protect people's privacy. The next 2 metrics are actually even more concerning. It's the number of privacy incidents that happen and the number of privacy complaints that are received from customers. Oceania is pretty consistent with our global findings. 60% look at the number of privacy incidents and 40% look at the number of complaints. I do not recommend relying on these metrics solely because you are waiting until something bad happens before you revise your training. Potentially, a data subject is going to experience significant harm as a result of your privacy awareness training program. You might be subject to fines. You might have reputational damage, but at the very least, you have in some way harmed your trust with your consumers. It's far better to do something a little bit more proactive, like doing pre and post training assessments. This doesn't need to be anything really involved. It can just be a couple of true or false questions that you do before and after the exam or after the training. And the really good thing about the pre-training, pre-assessment is that it can show you longitudinally if people are actually retaining the information that you provide them year over year, quarter over quarter, however often you're providing it. So if you aren't already doing just a simple pre and post-training assessment, I would highly recommend that you look into it. And so I know we've been talking a lot about privacy breaches. And so one of the things that we found is that breaches are kind of the same as they were last year. As in 2023's report, 11% of our survey respondents this year said that their organizations experienced a material privacy breach in the last 12 months. Oceania did a little bit better. They were at 9%. One thing that I think is really interesting is 18% of our respondents said they don't know if they experienced a privacy breach. And I think this touches on a previous point that Joe was talking about. Is it a security breach? Is it a privacy breach? If it is a privacy breach, how do we move forward? And I think this is also a broader issue of data management and data classification, understanding what qualifies as personal information. If we've been compromised, it's important to know if this is a privacy breach because depending on the laws and regulations to which we're subject, there may be certain notification things that we need to send out. On this slide, we have a question about if organizations are experiencing an increase or decrease in material privacy breaches compared to a year ago. And again, I'll draw your attention to the don't know. There's still just a lot of uncertainty around what is a privacy breach. And also it might just be a little bit of perhaps secrecy. You'll notice that 23% of our respondents said they didn't want to answer, which is totally fair. But I think that there is an area, this is an area to look out for because unfortunately, I think a lot of organizations are struggling when it comes to risk and privacy. And to illustrate that, we asked our survey respondents, how likely is it that your organization will experience a material privacy breach in the next year? 16% said it was likely. This was slightly higher in Oceania at 20%, but 23% don't know. Again, I think this speaks to the idea that understanding what constitutes a privacy breach isn't necessarily easy. And I think, again, it also relates to the idea of data classification. Some organizations just struggle to understand what the data is and actually flagging personal data as personal data to help identify and better respond to breaches. Joe, does any of this information about breaches surprise you?
Not really. Not really. It's again, I think because we've had such a turbulent time in this region, I think again people are a little bit reluctant to say because of the reputational issues and indeed the hit on the bottom line. I think they're loath to say out loud that they think a material breach is likely. I mean, frankly, I think we all live in the age where it's not a case of if, it's a case of when. Now, that doesn't mean it's today or tomorrow, and it might be way in the future, but at some point, I think it is going to happen. So I think that's part of it. I also think there is a fear of reporting as well. You know, once you're in the middle of that breach situation, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner seems like a really scary place to have to contact. So I think that's part of the issue here as well. So people are not wanting to say it out loud, and also a little bit frightened of the process. So I think there needs to be more education around the process as well. What happens if you do have a potentially material breach, and what happens when you do report that? So I think there's a lot of education to be had.
Yeah, that also touches on the compliance piece, because if there's several different laws and regulations in one, you might have a certain amount of time to notify people, where people in other jurisdictions need to be notified much sooner. So that's really interesting point.
Yeah, correct.
All right. And as far as the survey findings go, that is all I have. It looks like we have about 10 minutes remaining for questions.
We have loads of questions coming in, Sophia. It's wonderful. Now, the first one is, how important is it to avoid conflating cybersecurity with data privacy?
It is so very important. The way I describe it is, you can't have privacy without security, but you could have security without privacy. There are some organizations that do security very well, but they collect far too much personal information. I understand that this is a really complicated topic, because it's like Joe said, it's almost like a Venn diagram. I like the way that you explain that. And, you know, there is a lot of collaboration that needs to happen. But I think what happens, especially in smaller organizations, privacy is almost treated like a part of security. And so sometimes security professionals who are very good at security but don't have privacy knowledge are expected to do a lot of work that is potentially beyond the scope of what they know, but also what they have the capacity and resources to do. I know I was talking about, ideally, more people would be working with procurement and business development, and a person who is doing the full-time job of a security professional and a privacy professional does not have time to sit in meetings with procurement all of the time. I think it's really important to not just understand the differences, but be able to convey the differences to executives, because they're ultimately the people who are going to be making decisions that are going to affect the day-to-day work of privacy professionals and security professionals.
That's a great answer. I've got the next question is a really interesting one, Sophia, and that's, how can cultural differences be accounted for when it comes to business ethics?
That is a fantastic question. I think this is all about knowing your data, and specifically knowing your data subject. You know, for example, certain regions treat certain pieces of data as a little bit more sensitive. I live in the United States, where privacy is, it's not really, we care about privacy, but there's not much we can do to protect our own privacy. So that ethics piece is really crucial, but you can't know that until you know your data subjects. So where are your data subjects living? What are the norms and expectations around that? And as far as ethics goes, I think this is really an area where ethics really shines, specifically because there are certain regions where certain information might not be that big of a deal in the United States. My location information, and if people find out I'm visiting a certain place in the United States, might not be an issue. However, depending on the region I'm in, this information could potentially get me in legal trouble. It could have implications as far as people harming me based on my potentially political affiliations or religious affiliations. So know your data subjects. And I understand that it's so hard to understand the culture of every single person who provides you with data. But I think it is good to just be sensitive to the fact that regardless of where you operate, norms around data and privacy do vary. And it's not easy to do, but if you can do some kind of customer feedback, whether that's once a year, it can even just be a survey that people fill out about their expectations and their experiences sharing data with you, that can go a really long way to ensuring that your ethics and the way that you're approaching privacy align with your consumers' expectations.
Great. Now, I think the next one is going to fall to me, Sophia, because it's the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner addresses privacy complaints from ordinary people against organisations. Do you think this is a factor in the lower incidence of CPO roles in Oceania? I have to say I don't think so. I still go back to what I said originally, that we're not very good at promoting people to the C-suite, and recognising that privacy, there should be a chief privacy officer within an organisation. We saw the same thing for many, many years in the security space. So this is not unusual. Yes, the Office of the Information Commissioner does take complaints from ordinary people, but it's not always a quick turnaround either. So I think organisations who are answering questions from the Office of the Information Commissioner absolutely need to have a privacy officer to be able to respond to those questions. I also think that in a lot of organisations that it's often the CEO, as Safia had said, is the one who takes on that mantle of CPO, where in fact, to me, there's real room for conflict there in that case. But that's often what we see. So there'll be a privacy officer lower down the ranks, and it could very well sit in one of the corporate functions or indeed in legal. But then we also see that the CEO takes on the CPO role. It's kind of a long answer. So now the next question I've got is, Safia, back to you for this one. What kind of privacy do we prioritise if we're required to give our information in situations such as insurance claims and interviews?
That's a great question. So I would say understand the impact of the information that you're providing. For example, I am a little bit more willing to share my email address than my location data. Think about the impact. And again, I know this is hard because information from one source can be combined with information from another source. The other thing, and this is absolutely not fair, but a lot of times if you take a little bit of extra time and ask, you can get out of certain data processing. For example, I was at the airport in the United States going through customs, and they had an automatic face scanning. And in very fine print, it said, if you want to opt out of this, you can, and you'll be taken separately. And, there's a whole other area where we can do this. So if you are not comfortable providing certain information, it's well worth asking if there is an alternative. At least in the United States, very often there is an alternative, but providers aren't very forthcoming about that. They would rather have more information and make things a little bit easier. So I would say understand the ramifications of sharing the data in question. And if you are uncomfortable with it, ask if there's a way to get around it, or perhaps just ensure that it's not retained for an excessive amount of time. It's not going to be sold, that kind of thing.
I agree with you. And I also think it's really important that we understand what this data is being collected for. So if I'm being asked for information that doesn't seem reasonable, I ask, why are you asking me this? For what purpose is this information being collected, and how will it be secured and stored? Because to me, that's the other thing. If I'm giving you information about that's personal and private, including location, date of birth, all the things that could suddenly make up an identity, I start to become very worried. So yeah, I certainly ask the questions too. So the next question we have is, what is the current status of privacy legal requirements for smaller enterprises, and what's in the pipeline?
Yeah, so that's tricky. It really depends. I know in conversations I've had with Joe, what constitutes small in Australia is a little bit different than what constitutes small in the United States. So some laws and regulations do specifically say have different thresholds. Some of it is based on employee size. It might be based on revenue. It also might be based on the amount of data that you collect and how much that makes up your revenue. So for example, if you work for a data broker, even if it's a small data broker, there's probably a lot of information you're collecting. So it does depend. The one thing that I do think is important is even small enterprises, especially if you're working with other organizations that might be larger, they might come down and say, look, just to be safe, we need you to be GDPR compliant. And so even if it's not a legal mandate, it might be a little bit of a competitive advantage to ensure that you are compliant, or at least you have a baseline of doing privacy pretty well, regardless of if it is or isn't required. Joe, you're on mute.
I just realised that. I'm talking away, isn't it typical? I guess that we're actually out of time for questions now, and I'd like to say thank you, everyone, so much for those amazing questions, and what a great session this has been. I feel very privileged to have been able to work with Sophia to throw in a little bit of local flavour. So I'd like to give a really big thank you to her for joining us. I'd also like to thank both the ACS and the ISACA teams who've done amazing work behind the scenes, because for those of you who've done the calculation, you know it's the middle of the night for our US colleagues. So thank you so much for being with us. Just before I wrap up, I need to let you know about some of our ACS's upcoming events. So upcoming, we're offering a wide range of events which you can join virtually or indeed in person at your local branch. Our next Industry Insights event will be held on Thursday, the 21st of March, with Tim Hogarth, who is the CTO of ANZ. Tim will be discussing the commercial value of AI in large technology teams. I've heard Tim speak before, and this would be really well worth going or attending. So please also visit the ACS events page to find out more about ACS upcoming events in your local branches too. Please take a minute to complete our post-event survey via the link in the pop-up. We're dedicated to providing you with better experiences, so your feedback is absolutely valuable to us. For ISACA members, after viewing this webinar, you're eligible to self-claim 1 CPE. Yay! This event will also be made available on YouTube for on-demand viewing for the next 365 days. So that's a year. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us tonight. It really has been a great evening. And again, thank you so much, Sophia. Thank you, everyone.